The house, nestled on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, was picturesque in every way. With its white picket fence and blooming flower beds, it appeared to be the ideal family home. Inside, the atmosphere was calm, yet there was an undercurrent of tension, a subtle unease that clung to the air just beneath the surface. It was the kind of quiet where nothing was truly wrong, but everything felt slightly off. At the heart of this seemingly perfect home was Emma, the newlywed stepmother, trying desperately to fit into a family that wasn't entirely hers. Recently married to James, a kind-hearted man with 2 children, she hoped to create a warm and loving environment for everyone. But no matter how hard she tried to present herself as the ideal wife and stepmother, there was a sense of disconnection that no amount of effort could overcome. James, a devoted father, was caught between his love for his new wife and his deep affection for his children, Sophia and Ethan. Sophia, a teenager, remained distant and sullen, not ready to embrace the new woman in her father's life. Ethan, the younger of the two, seemed more open, but was still adjusting to the idea of having a new mother figure, unsure of what that meant for his relationship with his real mother. The tension was palpable, and while everyone tried to maintain the appearance of normalcy, the air was thick with unspoken words and unresolved feelings. Amid this delicate balance, Emma was hiding a secret, a decision she made in a moment of impatience. At first, it seemed trivial, something she could brush aside, but it was a decision that would unravel the fragile piece she had worked so hard to build. A simple mistake, born out of jealousy, desperation, or perhaps miscommunication, would change everything. The mistake was small, but the consequences were anything but. She never imagined that the ripple effect of this one moment would lead to a breaking point that no one could foresee. And now, as she navigated this new life, she felt the weight of her mistake growing, like a storm waiting to break. Little did she know, this one error would fracture the family in ways she couldn't yet understand, and the ripple effects would echo through every room of the house. Her secret would soon be exposed, and when it was, everything would change. Emma had always dreamed of having the kind of family she never had. Raised by a single mother who struggled to make ends meet, Emma spent much of her childhood feeling the absence of a stable father figure. Her mother, though loving and strong, had little time for emotional nurturing, as she was always working to support them. This left Emma with a deep longing for a family that was whole, where love, support and togetherness were constants rather than rare glimpses. Her past relationships were a reflection of that desire. As an adult, she had fallen into a pattern of seeking out men who promised security and stability, only to find herself disillusioned time and time again. Each relationship seemed to start with hope, but ended in disappointment. She never felt truly loved or understood. Emma found herself either giving too much or not enough, always adjusting herself to fit into someone else's life, while never truly fitting into her own. Her last serious relationship ended painfully, the result of years of emotional distance and unspoken resentments. She had hoped her next chapter would be different. When she met James, it felt like fate. He was kind, patient, and attentive, everything Emma had longed for. His warmth made her feel seen and valued in a way she hadn't felt in years. James was everything she had dreamed of, a man who not only cared for her but was a good father, attentive and loving toward his children. He had a steady job, a home, and a calm demeanor that reassured Emma that maybe, just maybe, this could be the family she had always wanted. Their connection felt easy and natural, and in a whirlwind romance, they decided to marry. But despite her hope, Emma brought with her a heavy emotional baggage into this new life. The weight of her past relationships, the loneliness of her childhood, and the fear of repeating her old mistakes lingered in the back of her mind. She had married James out of a desire for stability, but also out of an unconscious need to heal the wounds from her past. Her relationship with James was everything she had hoped for, but she was still carrying the scars of her previous disappointments. Her internal battle between love and fear constantly simmered beneath her smile. When Emma first entered James's home, She envisioned a life of togetherness. She believed that with time she would forge meaningful bonds with the children, Sophia and Ethan, and that they would blend into one big happy family. Emma was determined to be the perfect stepmother, firm yet loving, supportive yet clear in her role. She hoped that the children would come to accept her not only as James's wife, but as a mother figure in their lives, despite the awkwardness of the situation. She was well aware of the challenges that blended families faced, but she believed that her patience and kindness would eventually win them over. She imagined cozy evenings together, long family dinners, and holidays spent in the warmth of familial togetherness. But reality, as she quickly learned, was more complicated. Sophia, at 14, was a teenager caught between resentment and reluctance. She barely acknowledged Emma's presence, and when she did, it was with a look of indifference or, worse, mild disdain. Sophia was protective of her relationship with her father and didn't appreciate the intrusion of a new woman into that dynamic. Her teenage rebellion was only heightened by the arrival of someone she was expected to accept as a new maternal figure, a role she neither wanted nor asked for. She was angry at the situation, angry at her father for remarrying, and angry at Emma for simply existing in her father's life. Ethan, who was only 8, seemed more willing to accept the idea of a new mother figure, but his acceptance was superficial at best. He enjoyed the novelty of having someone to play games with and share silly jokes, but he could never fully let go of the bond he had with his mother. His behavior was unpredictable, sometimes affectionate and open, other times distant and cold. Emma tried to maintain a calm and loving demeanor with him, but the underlying tension always seemed to bubble just below the surface. James, aware of the strain in the house, tried his best to be the peacemaker. He would gently encourage his children to be more understanding toward Emma, but his efforts only seemed to add pressure to an already delicate situation. He loved Emma, but he also loved his children fiercely, and the delicate balance between the two was something he was constantly trying to maintain. He would often find himself caught between his desire to support Emma and his need to protect his children. When the occasional argument arose, whether about chores, rules, or misunderstandings, James would try to smooth things over, offering apologies or explanations to both sides. But there was only so much he could do. He could tell that Emma was trying her best, but he also saw the frustration building within her. The house, once a peaceful sanctuary, now felt like a battleground. Each day brought its own set of challenges. Emma's hopes of creating a harmonious home seemed to drift further away as the tensions grew. She wondered if she would ever fully belong, if the children would ever accept her, or if she would forever be the outsider in this family. Despite the love she felt for James, there were moments when she wondered whether this was truly the life she had hoped for, or whether she was simply repeating the mistakes of her past. As time went on, Emma began to feel the weight of the expectations placed upon her. She was supposed to be the perfect stepmother, but what did that really mean? The pressure was mounting, and although she had hoped that her new life would be a fresh start, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was already failing. The growing sense of dissatisfaction gnawed at her, and she felt as though something deep inside her was about to crack. Little did she know that the moment she would choose to make a mistake she would regret for the rest of her life, was fast approaching. It was an ordinary afternoon, one of those quiet, overcast days that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Emma stood in the kitchen, her hands busy with dinner preparations, but her mind was elsewhere, tangled in the web of her emotions. The children were in their respective rooms, lost in their own worlds. James was at work, and the house was almost too still. Emma had come to dread this silence. She had been married to James for almost 6 months now, and yet the connection with his children still felt strained. Sophia was distant and critical, never fully accepting her as a mother figure, while Ethan's affections, though genuine, never seemed to be enough to bridge the gap. Emma had been patient, trying to understand their needs, their hurt. But on this particular day, a small moment broke her. It started with a simple incident, a brief exchange in the living room between James and his children. It was the kind of trivial moment that could easily be brushed off, but for Emma, it was the spark that ignited a series of events she would later wish she could undo. Sophia had been sitting on the couch, flicking through her phone, when James came home from work. He greeted her with his usual warmth, and she responded with a forced smile, barely lifting her eyes from the screen. Emma watched from the kitchen, her chest tightening as she observed their interaction. James was always so gentle with his children, especially Sophia. There was a bond between them, one that Emma could never penetrate. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. It wasn't that Emma didn't understand the relationship between father and daughter. She did. But there was a part of her that envied it. She wanted that closeness, that natural ease. She wanted to be the one he turned to after a long day, not just a wife, but a partner in his children's lives. Emma had always felt like an outsider, and as she stood there, watching James and Sophia share a quiet, unspoken connection, the loneliness she had been carrying for months suddenly seemed unbearable. Her jealousy, though not malicious, bubbled up. It wasn't a grand emotion, more like a pinprick of insecurity, one that Emma had pushed down many times before. But this time, it was different. This time, she decided to act on it. When Sophia went upstairs to her room, Emma followed her, her mind clouded by a mix of frustration and a desperate need to feel validated. The words came out before she could stop them. "You know," Emma began, her voice shaky but determined, "I think your dad is really worried about you. You've been distant lately, and I think he feels like you're pulling away." Sophia looked at her, her expression unreadable. "I'm fine," she replied curtly, not giving Emma the satisfaction of a longer response. "I know you're upset about Mom," Emma continued, a note of caution missing from her tone. "But you can't shut everyone out. You're hurting your dad too." Sophia's face hardened, and for a moment, Emma saw the familiar flash of anger in her stepdaughter's eyes. "You don't know anything about my mum," Sophia snapped, her voice sharp. Emma flinched, the words stinging more than she expected. But she pressed on, a quiet desperation in her voice. "I just want to help, Sophia. I'm not trying to replace anyone. I'm here for you." It was a lie. In truth, Emma had never been able to shake the feeling that she was competing with the memory of Sophia's mother, a woman who would always hold a place in her children's hearts. But in that moment, she felt a sudden, irrational need to be seen, truly seen, as more than just James's wife. She wanted to be a mother figure, to be important in their lives. The weight of her insecurities had clouded her better judgment, and now the words she had spoken lingered in the air, thick with unspoken tension. The immediate aftermath of the conversation was swift. Sophia stormed off to her room, slamming the door behind her. Emma stood frozen for a moment, feeling a pang of regret as the reality of what she had just done began to settle in. She had crossed a line, one that she knew was fragile and necessary for the balance of their family. But the damage was done, and the consequences began to unfold almost immediately. Later that evening, when James came home, he immediately sensed the shift. He could feel the tension in the house as soon as he walked through the door. Sophia's silence was deafening, and Ethan's usual chatter seemed oddly absent. Emma had done her best to prepare dinner, but the warmth she had hoped for was absent. Instead, there was a chill in the air, and no matter how hard she tried to smooth things over, it only made the situation worse. "Emma," James began cautiously after dinner, his brow furrowed as he looked at her. "What happened with you and Sophia?" Emma's stomach churned. She hesitated, unsure how to explain without revealing her own insecurities. "It was nothing," she said quickly, her voice too high-pitched to sound convincing. "We just talked. She's having a rough time, that's all." James studied her closely, sensing the unease in her tone. He wasn't blind to the tension that had been building between Emma and his children, but he never expected things to escalate like this. He wanted to believe her, but a nagging doubt began to form in his mind. The way Emma had spoken earlier, the way Sophia had reacted. It all felt off. The next few days were a blur of awkward silences and half-formed conversations. The children began to retreat further into their worlds, and Emma found herself more isolated than ever. What had started as an attempt to be more involved, to break through the emotional distance, had backfired. She couldn't shake the feeling that the cracks she had tried so hard to fill had just gotten deeper. Sophia's coldness grew, and Ethan's previously sweet nature began to change, his interactions with Emma growing more distant. James, though he tried to maintain peace, began to look at Emma with concern. He hadn't quite figured out what had happened, but he could tell something had shifted. His suspicion grew, though he didn't voice it, yet. Emma's mistake wasn't just in what she had said. It was in believing that she could fix things with words, that by taking control of the situation, she could force a change. But in doing so, she had alienated the very people she was trying to connect with. She had, unknowingly, become the catalyst for the unraveling of the fragile family dynamic that had taken months to build. The consequences of that one decision, though they seemed small at first, would echo through the walls of their home for weeks to come. And Emma, standing at the center of it all, was about to realize that some mistakes couldn't be undone. The days following the conversation with Sophia felt like walking on eggshells. At first, Emma tried to convince herself that everything would settle down on its own, that the harsh words exchanged between her and Sophia were just part of the natural tension in a blended family. But the unease didn't go away. If anything, it only grew more pronounced with each passing day. The children became more distant, and the walls of silence between them and Emma seemed to stretch further, as if a chasm had opened up between them that couldn't be bridged. Sophia, in particular, was quieter than ever. She no longer made an effort to even pretend to be civil. Whenever Emma entered a room, Sophia's gaze would flicker to her for a brief moment before quickly turning away. Her lips pressed tight, her body language rigid. The coldness was palpable. It was as if she had built an emotional wall between them, and nothing Emma did seemed to make a difference. The more she tried to be understanding, to offer her help or show affection, the more Sophia recoiled. Emma had no idea how to approach her anymore, or if she even wanted to. Ethan, too, had changed. While his behavior wasn't as overtly hostile as Sophia's, there was an underlying distance that hadn't been there before. The little boy who once eagerly climbed into her lap to tell her about his day now found excuses to avoid her. He no longer wanted to sit with her at dinner, and when he did, his eyes avoided hers, focused instead on his plate or his phone. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that he was mimicking his sister's behavior, pulling away because it seemed like the only safe thing to do. It was as if the ripple effect of that one conversation with Sophia had spread through the house, infecting the relationships, slowly unraveling the delicate thread of trust that had taken months to weave. Emma knew she was responsible for it, but every time she tried to address it, the words felt hollow, the apologies inadequate. The more she tried to make things right, the more she seemed to dig herself deeper into a hole she couldn't escape. James had noticed the change, of course. He was no fool. The once vibrant and peaceful atmosphere in their home had been replaced by a quiet tension that even he couldn't ignore. The children had become withdrawn, and Emma had grown more anxious and defensive. His concern for her, once a source of comfort, had now morphed into worry. He would ask her about it, of course, but Emma would always wave it away with a forced smile, claiming everything was fine. But James was beginning to sense that something more was going on, something his wife wasn't telling him. But Emma, caught in a whirlwind of guilt, pride, and fear, wasn't ready to admit the truth. To her, it was easier to deny it than to face it. The nagging voice in the back of her mind told her she had made a mistake, but she refused to acknowledge it fully. There were moments when she could feel the guilt gnawing at her, urging her to apologize, to make amends. But then pride would rise up, and she'd convince herself that it wasn't entirely her fault. After all, she had only been trying to help, to connect, to show that she cared. The internal conflict inside her became a storm that Emma couldn't seem to calm. There were nights when she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with Sophia over and over again. What if she had just been more patient? What if she hadn't said anything at all? What if she had simply waited for Sophia to come to her when she was ready? But even as these thoughts surfaced, Emma would brush them aside, justifying her actions as though it were some kind of necessary step. She couldn't let herself feel too guilty. That would mean admitting she had failed. The paranoia began to creep in slowly. Emma found herself second-guessing everything. When she heard the children whispering in the hallway or caught a glimpse of them, exchanging glances when she entered a room, she couldn't help but wonder if they were talking about her. Were they plotting against her? Had Sophia shared her feelings with Ethan, and now they were both avoiding her on purpose? She began to feel as though she were being watched, scrutinized at every turn. The more she tried to keep the family together, the more they seemed to slip away. It was as though she was slowly losing her grip on them, and the more she grasped, the further they seemed to drift. In her desperation, Emma began to cover up the cracks, telling herself that things were fine, that it was just a phase. But each time she tried to keep up the facade, she felt it slip further away. There was a forced cheerfulness in her voice whenever James came home, a false sense of normalcy that couldn't fool anyone, least of all herself. Her attempts to be the perfect stepmother, to make everything right, were starting to fall apart. Her guilt began to manifest in ways she couldn't control. There were moments when she would lash out at James, snapping at him for things that normally wouldn't have bothered her. She accused him of not seeing the tension in the house, of not doing enough to fix things, even though she knew deep down that he was doing everything he could. She started to turn her frustrations on him, blaming him for the breakdown in communication, when in reality it was her own actions that had set the stage for this disarray. James, for his part, tried to remain calm and patient. He could see the guilt and frustration in Emma's eyes, even when she tried to hide it behind a smile. He wanted to help, to fix things. But every time he reached out, Emma pulled away, defending herself rather than acknowledging the underlying issue. The more she resisted, the more James grew concerned, and the more distant the relationship between them became. The longer Emma lived in this state of denial and guilt, the more isolated she felt. The mistake she had made, small and seemingly insignificant at first, was now a rift so deep that it seemed impossible to repair. The trust that had once existed between her and the children was slipping through her fingers, and all the while she couldn't bring herself to face the full extent of her actions. The more she tried to keep the peace, the more she found herself adding fuel to the fire, unknowingly pushing away the very people she was desperate to connect with. In the silence that filled their home, Emma began to realize something. The hardest thing to fix wasn't the mistake itself. It was the damage it had done to the fragile trust they had all worked so hard to build, and that, she feared, might be the thing that would tear their family apart forever. The weeks following the fallout from the stepmother's decision felt like a slow descent into chaos. Emma tried to convince herself that things might return to normal with time, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the damage had already been done. The tension in the house was palpable, like a thick fog that hung over everything they did. No matter how hard she tried to smooth things over, the cracks in the family's foundation only deepened. James, who had once been her rock, was growing more distant. His attempts to keep the peace had started to feel more like attempts to hold together a structure that was already falling apart. It was as though he could see the destruction that Emma had caused, but was too afraid to confront it. Every evening when he came home from work, he walked into the house with a forced smile, trying to act like everything was okay, but the tension between them was now impossible to ignore. The children, too, were becoming harder to reach. Sophia, once a somewhat quiet but respectful teenager, now wore a permanent mask of resentment. She would roll her eyes when Emma spoke, snapping back with sharp, defensive words that cut deeper than Emma was willing to admit. She had once been polite, if distant, but now there was a growing bitterness in her interactions. Sophia no longer tried to hide it. She made no secret of her disdain for Emma, and it was clear she blamed her stepmother for the disarray that had entered their once harmonious home. Ethan, though younger, had started to emulate his sister's behaviour. Where once he had been full of warmth and openness, he now avoided Emma's gaze altogether, lost in his own world. He would retreat to his room, his face buried in his tablet, and when Emma tried to engage him, he would barely respond, his eyes flickering only long enough to acknowledge her presence before turning back to his screen. At first, Emma tried to convince herself that they were just going through a phase, that it was normal for children to rebel when a new authority figure entered their lives. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. The guilt she had been trying to bury resurfaced in waves, each more overwhelming than the last. It was like a weight in her chest, a constant reminder that she had made a mistake she could never undo. But the hardest part was watching James grow increasingly disillusioned with her and the situation. He had always been patient, always tried to understand, but now there was a weariness in his eyes, a frustration that he could no longer conceal. He had stopped asking Emma how she was feeling, or if she wanted to talk. His silence spoke louder than any words could. The love they had shared once felt strong and unshakable, but now Emma feared it was starting to crack too. Then one evening, it all came to a head. It was a rare family dinner. James had insisted on it, hoping to bring some semblance of normalcy back to their lives. But as they sat at the table, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. The children picked at their food, barely looking up. Emma felt the weight of the silence pressing down on her, and it was clear James did too. After a few minutes, he finally put his fork down and looked at Emma. "Emma," he began, his voice quieter than usual, "I think it's time we talk about this, about what's been going on." Emma's stomach twisted into knots. She knew what was coming, but she wasn't prepared for it. She had hoped, prayed, that things would somehow resolve themselves. But the hurt in James's eyes made it clear that this was no longer something they could ignore. "You've been avoiding the issue," James continued. "I see how you're pulling away from the kids, and I see how they're pulling away from you. This isn't just a phase anymore, Emma. It's breaking us apart." Emma opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She had no defense. She knew he was right. The guilt surged again, making her throat close tighter. The mistake she had made felt like a wall between them, one that she couldn't tear down no matter how hard she tried. Sophia, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke up, her voice dripping with bitterness. "You don't get it, do you? We don't want you here. You ruined everything. You're not our mum, and you're never going to be." Ethan didn't speak, but the look in his eyes was enough. He didn't have to say anything. The silent accusation was all too clear. Emma flinched, the words hitting her like a slap. She had always feared this moment, but now that it had arrived, it felt even worse than she had imagined. Her throat burned, and for the first time in a long while, she felt completely alone. The family she had hoped to build, the family she had worked so hard for, was slipping away from her, piece by piece. James stood up from the table and paced to the other side of the room, rubbing his temples as if the weight of it all was too much to bear. "I don't know what to do anymore, Emma. I don't know how to fix this." Emma stood up too, her legs trembling. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I was just trying to make things better." But the words felt hollow. The damage was done, and no apology, no explanation, could change that. The confrontation wasn't a sudden explosion. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was enough to break the dam that Emma had built around her guilt and shame. It was the moment she could no longer deny the depth of her mistake. The family was broken, and the question that lingered in the air was whether they could ever heal, or whether this was the beginning of the end. James's expression softened for a moment, but it quickly hardened again. "I need some time, Emma. We all do." The words were like a death sentence. Time. That was all they needed now. Time to figure out if there was anything left worth saving. Emma sank back into her chair, her hands trembling. There was no more pretending. The fallout had begun, and it was up to each of them to decide if there was a way to move forward, or if the damage was too great to fix. The house was quieter than ever. In the weeks following the confrontation, Emma had learned that silence could be as painful as the loudest arguments. Every creak of the floorboards, every soft murmur of the wind outside, seemed to echo with the weight of her actions. The anger and resentment that had followed her mistake hadn't disappeared. They lingered in the corners of the house like shadows, refusing to be chased away. But amidst the brokenness, there were signs of something small, something fragile, that Emma could hold on to. Slowly, cautiously, the family began the difficult process of healing. The step toward healing. The first step toward healing was one Emma hadn't anticipated. She had to confront herself before she could confront the family. She spent hours alone in her room, reflecting on what had happened and how it had all gone wrong. The mistake she made wasn't just a momentary lapse of judgment. It was a betrayal of trust, the one thing that had always held relationships together, and without it, nothing could truly work. She had tried to fit into a family without truly understanding its foundation. In trying to control the situation, she had unknowingly pushed everyone further away. James, ever the peacemaker, was the first to break the silence. He didn't come to her with accusations or anger. Instead, he came with a quiet request. "Emma, we need to talk," he said one evening, his voice still thick with the remnants of their previous confrontation. She nodded, knowing that this moment was unavoidable. Sitting down across from him in the dimly lit living room, Emma felt her heart racing in her chest. "I know I've made a mess of things," she began, the words more painful than she could have imagined. "I've hurt you all, and I can't take that back, but I want to make it right. I want to be a better stepmother, a better partner, a better person." James studied her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Finally he nodded, though there was a sadness in his eyes. "It's not just about saying sorry, Emma. It's about showing us you mean it. We've all been hurt, and it's going to take time." Emma understood. Words could only go so far. If she wanted to rebuild trust, she would have to prove it through actions. She had to demonstrate that she was capable of change, that she was truly committed to making this family whole again. The next step in her redemption came when Emma made a deliberate effort to connect with each of the children. Sophia and Ethan were both reluctant at first, their walls still high, their trust fractured. But Emma persisted. She started small, making their favourite meals, asking about their day, showing up at their school events even when they didn't ask her to. She didn't expect immediate forgiveness. She knew that trust couldn't be rebuilt in a day. But she kept showing up, determined to be there for them, no matter how difficult it felt. For Sophia, it was harder. She had every right to be angry with Emma. The rift between them seemed insurmountable, especially with the years of unspoken tension that had accumulated in the background. But slowly Emma noticed small changes. Sophia began to speak to her again, not with warmth, but with civility. And for Emma, that was enough for now. It was a crack in the wall, a small sign that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been broken. Ethan, being younger, was more easily swayed. He still avoided her when he could, but he began to accept her presence more. When Emma took him to a local amusement park, just the two of them, he let her hold his hand on the Ferris wheel. It wasn't a big moment, but it was a moment that showed that, despite everything, a tiny flicker of trust remained. There was no magic moment, where everything suddenly became perfect. Healing takes time, especially in a family as fractured as theirs. But Emma was determined. She knew that if she wanted to save her marriage, her relationship with the children, and perhaps even her own peace of mind, she needed to give more than just apologies. She needed to show change. Lessons learned. As time went on, the lessons Emma learned became more apparent. She realized that in her desperate need for control and acceptance, she had forgotten the fundamental principle of family: trust. It wasn't something you could demand or manipulate. It had to be earned, and once broken, it was incredibly difficult to restore. She had learned, perhaps too late, that the most important element of any relationship, whether between spouses or parents and children, is the ability to communicate openly, honestly, and without fear of judgment. She had also learned the consequences of hiding things, even with the best intentions. Her secret, her mistake, was never intended to hurt anyone, but in trying to control a situation, she had only made everything worse. The damage caused by a lie, no matter how small, was far-reaching, and the only way to heal it was through brutal honesty. Finally, Emma had learned that family loyalty was a delicate balance between personal desires and the needs of those around you. It wasn't about what she wanted or needed. It was about what the family as a whole needed to feel safe, loved, and supported. In her quest for acceptance, Emma had ignored the needs of those who had already been through so much, her husband and his children. And by doing so, she had neglected the very thing that could have kept them together: trust. End of the journey or a new beginning. As the weeks turned into months, Emma and her family began to move forward. There were still moments of tension, moments where the scars of the past seemed to reappear, but there were also moments of connection. They had not erased the mistake Emma made, but they had learned to live with it. The family was different now, stronger in some ways, broken in others, but still they were together. There was no grand conclusion, no promise that everything would be perfect. The scars of Emma's mistake would always linger, a quiet reminder of what had been lost and what had been gained. But as she sat in the living room, her family around her, Emma realized that healing was never about erasing the past. It was about learning from it and choosing to move forward. And so, the future remained uncertain, but full of possibility. The mistake made by the stepmother, though painful and disruptive, became a pivotal turning point in the family's journey. It shook the foundations of their relationships, but in the aftermath, it sparked moments of reflection and growth. Emma's journey toward redemption was not easy, and the scars left by her actions would never fully disappear. But it set in motion a slow and steady process of healing. For the children, it became an opportunity to rebuild their trust in her, though it would take time. They learned to see her not just as a stepmother, but as someone who, despite her flaws, was trying to make amends. For Emma, the hardest lesson was learning that control over a family wasn't something that could be gained through manipulation or secrecy. It had to be earned, built on honesty and vulnerability. Through her actions, she proved that change was possible, even when the past couldn't be erased. Though the mistake had caused irreparable damage to the family's dynamics, it also led to growth. For Emma as an individual, for James as a husband, and for the children as they navigated the complex nature of blended families. The boundaries they set moving forward were necessary, and although the future remained uncertain, they were beginning to understand what it truly meant to be a family. In the end, the family chose to move forward, carrying the lessons of the past with them, while creating space for new beginnings. The journey wasn't perfect, but the resilience they found in one another offered a flicker of hope, showing that even the most painful mistakes can lead to a future rooted in healing, change, and new connections.